Welcome, everyone. My name is David Chard, and I am the Dean of Boston University's Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. This evening, we are honored to co-sponsor with the Ivy Street School in Brookline, Massachusetts, the second in a series of discussions about the consequences of the pandemic on schools and students. In the spring, we had an important and enlightening conversation entitled Reversing Course, Learning Loss in a Global Pandemic, featuring national nonprofit and state policy leaders. Tonight, we advance that discussion to talk about specific efforts that some are taken to address the impact of the pandemic on student learning and development in a conversation entitled Reversing Course, Promising Strategies to Address Unfinished Learning. We have invited another esteemed panel to illustrate specific efforts they are involved in to help students across the country as we all work to ameliorate the challenges of unfinished learning. Our panel members, who will be introduced to you shortly, represent large school district leadership, higher education policy experts, and researchers who are closely analyzing the data associated with the pandemic. All share a common interest in promoting equity through educational opportunity. Before we get to our discussion, let me remind you of a few details about tonight's event. We are in Zoom webinar format. This means that you can enter your questions into the Q&A box. I will be monitoring your questions, as will other members of the panel, and moving them forward to our panelists as appropriate, and when possible, answering them myself through text. Also, closed captioning or subtitles are available. You only need to toggle the closed caption in the Zoom bar. We will try to leave 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end of the discussion. During this evening's webinar, we will be joined by several voices from the field who we have invited to share questions with the panelists through video. Finally, this webinar will be recorded. We'll make it available on the BU Wheelock and the Ivy Street YouTube channels. Follow us on social media if you are so inclined. We'll put those links in the chat across the evening. It is now my distinct honor to introduce the evening's moderator, my friend and colleague, Brandon Cardet Hernandez. Brandon is Executive Director of the Ivy Street School, which serves students with unique neurocognitive and neurodevelopmental needs. The Ivy Street School is a national leader in neurodiverse education. Brandon is a first-generation Cuban American who has spent his career fighting to advance equity and access for young people. A lifelong educator, he has worked as a community organizer, college and career counselor, and special education teacher. He was the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the New York City Department of Education, guiding strategy for the city's most struggling schools. As a public school principal, Brandon led the Urban Assembly Bronx Academy of Letters through a dramatic turnaround, driving a transformation of student outcomes, school culture, and developing strategic partnerships for sustained success. Most recently, Brandon worked as a senior education advisor to Mayor Bill de Blasio, where he helped launch the nation's largest expansion of early childhood education with a citywide 3K and pre-K program. Brandon's work has been featured in Essence Magazine, Ed Week, The Atlantic, People in Espanol, and the Netflix documentary Teach Us All. Brandon, thank you for co-hosting, and I'll pass it to you.
I'm unmuting myself, and thank you so much, David. A great introduction. And it's just nice to be with you today. I wish we were in person. I'm gonna start by, first, I just wanna thank everyone who puts all of this together. And I think sometimes we forget to do that. There's like a bunch of people behind the scenes working magic so that we can make this happen digitally. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And for everyone who's here with us tonight. As David shared, in April, we launched Reversing Course, our first conversation. Jonah Edelman, the CEO of Stanford Children, Lindsay Jones, the president of the National Center for Learning Disabilities, and Heather Pesky, the Associate Commissioner for Instructional Support here at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in Massachusetts. They were all part of the panel. We talked about the idea of loss. What did our students lose? What did our families lose? We also talked about gains. What did our students and families gain? What did our systems gain? And we talked about measuring unfinished learning systematically and holistically. And we talked about innovative and tangible ways for schools, districts, and service providers to seize the moment, from block scheduling to narrative grades, advisory periods, reimagined assessments, and of course, focusing instruction through power standards or standards-based instruction. We covered a lot of ground. Two headlines haven't left me. One was, how do we do this work without falling into a deficit model and without that becoming the frame in which we see fit? Two, that the problems facing the school system right now are not entirely new, particularly for our most vulnerable kids and families. What is new is that these gaps have widened and that many white families and families with greater financial flexibility are experiencing a system that is not working for them in the ways that they are used to. And maybe that increased impact and growing concern will help drive some long-term evidence-based fixes, innovations, and solutions that many educators and communities, particularly communities of color and families of students with disabilities, have been fighting for long before COVID. I want to start there because it's just important to sort of build off of that reality. We have been thinking about the achievement gap and the opportunity gap and solutions for a really long time. There's a lot of knowledge and there's a lot of strategy that already exists. And tonight, we're going to take a temperature check, here and now. What do we know about the problems we're facing? What are we seeing and knowing about how our students are doing socially, emotionally, and academically? And what should we be thinking about as we move into the fall? In a sea of priorities, what feels like the winning mix? And also, what's been happening this summer? That one might change the way we think about summer and summer learning loss in the future, and two, will impact how we're thinking about the fall. And to have that conversation, we have pulled together a truly dynamite group of women who are driving the big ideas and the solutions. First, we have Emma Dorn, a senior knowledge expert with McKinsey. Emma leads knowledge development and dissemination for McKinsey's education work around the globe. She also serves clients across the public, private, and social sectors, including school systems, higher education institutions, technology companies, and not-for-profits. Emma's focus also includes improving access and quality of education for historically underserved populations. And of course, she has literally shaped our current thinking on how school systems can respond to COVID-19 pandemic and reimagine more equitable school systems emerging from the crisis. And second, good, that's good, but there's more, we've got more. Second, we have Susanna Lowe, the director of Annenberg Institute at Brown University. Susanna's research focuses broadly on education policy and its role in improving educational outcomes and opportunities for students. Her work has addressed educator career choices and professional development issues, finance and governance, and early childhood education. She's the founder and acting executive director of the National Student Support Accelerator. Susanna is leading incredible research, thinking, and program design on the power of high-impact tutoring. Our third panelist, going fast because I want to get to this conversation. Our third panelist is Bethany M. Allen, a writer, educator, and racial and gender equity facilitator. She currently serves as the director of Equitable Pathways in the Office of Strategy and Innovation for Boston Public Schools, helping design and develop mentorship programs in Boston. Before this, she was the statewide initiatives director for the Boston Alliance of LGBT Youth and director of programs at Peer Health Exchange. And last but not least is Chancellor Misha Porter. She is the chancellor of the New York City Department of Education, the largest school system in the nation. She is the first Black woman to lead the system's 1 million students in over 1,800 schools. She's a lifelong New Yorker, a product of the city's public schools, and Chancellor Porter has climbed every rung of the DOE's professional ladder over nearly 25 years. Community coordinator to English teacher, assistant principal, district superintendent, and Bronx executive superintendent. Now she's the chancellor. She recently launched the Summer Rising program in New York City, an innovative summer school where every student has access to summer programming and learning. So I told you it was a great group. An incredible sort of array of women doing this work, from research to program design to system leadership. And so we have the right minds driving the thinking here to help us sort of figure out what's next. But I want to dive in. And the first question I'm going to ask for all of our panelists, and I'm going to start with Susanna, and then I'm going to move to you, Emma, and then we'll go to Bethany, and then we'll end with Misha, so you know. But the first question I want to ask you, Susanna, is how would you describe the problem we're experiencing? And what are you, in your work, what are you currently doing to address it?
Oh, that's such a great question, and thank you for having me here today too. This is such an exciting group to be part of, and I super appreciate being here. Well, school got disrupted, right? So there's the catch, and a lot of students experienced, as we know, really difficult times over the last year and a half. And as a result, I think many kids did not get access to the kind of educational opportunities, even that they usually get access to. And on top of that, many of them disengaged in ways that we haven't seen before. The amount of absenteeism from either in-person or online schooling just increased in ways that we've never seen before. And this has had really negative consequences, of course, on them. At the same time, it's really allowed us to think about all of the inequalities and other difficulties that students have had even in prior years before the pandemic, and how, because we suddenly have all this disruption in schools, we suddenly have this opportunity to think, wow, this doesn't necessarily, it hasn't been like it was in the past, and it doesn't necessarily need to be like it is now. Certainly we don't want it, but we might not really want it exactly like it was in the past either. And so I think we're really in an exciting time where we are thinking about each student, and that some students really need much greater supports than they've had before. How can we get them there? We can rethink some of the ways that we provide education and supports to them for their learning. And we actually have some new funds coming into schools that we haven't seen before that allow us to make use of that. So I think we're in a terrible time in some ways and in an exciting time in other ways, because we really could address some of the things that we've been all trying to work on for so many years.
I appreciate that, Susanna. Emma, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Sure. So again, really excited to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I think as I think about what is the problem that we're facing, it's really a multifaceted problem. And so as we've been doing our research, we've noted that it's an academic problem. And, you know, students have been out of school, some of them with great access to digital devices and remote learning, some of them with terrible access to internet devices and remote learning. And that's really had a cost academically on students. And based on our research, we looked at the curriculum associates assessments of about 1.6 million children across the country. And those are students who actually made it back into school for assessments at the end of last year. So this is probably an optimistic view. And what we found is that students were about 5 months behind in math and 4 months behind in reading where they would have been absent the pandemic. And those are big numbers. That's of a 10-month school year. So that's half a year behind in math. And one of the really worrying things is that it's hitting students who have historically been disadvantaged harder. And it is widening some of those existing gaps in the education system. We weren't able to do analysis at the student level due to student privacy, but we looked at students in majority Black schools and found that they were actually 6 months behind where they would have been in math. And students in low-income schools were about 7 months behind. But that's only one part of the problem. I think you can over-anchor on the academics. It's also really important to understand this is a multifaceted problem. And this is a problem also for students' social and emotional health, for their mental health. We did a survey of 16,000 parents across all 50 states of the US, and we found that 35% were very or extremely worried about their students' mental health. Yeah. That's over a third of parents who are very or extremely worried. And over 80% had some level of worry. And we saw parents reporting increased levels of anxiety and depression in their students, social withdrawal, isolation, lethargy, irrational fears. And I could see that even in my own students who, as they went out of school and into school and out of school again, and now, God willing, back into school for this school year, just the emotional roller coaster ride that has been. And then remember that for many students, it's also been a roller coaster ride in their personal lives too, with maybe some students have lost family members, some students have had family members lose jobs. And so I think as we think forward into recovery, thinking through not just the academic impacts of the pandemic, but also the broader impacts on students. And as we think through, how do we support students to recover, to take that wide lens?
Thank you so much, Emma. Bethany, it's your turn. How are you seeing the problem that we're experiencing?
So first of all, thank you so much for having me here tonight. And thank you to Brandon and David and all the folks who organized this panel. I'm really excited to talk about the work that I've been doing at BPS, which dovetails nicely with where Emma left off, which is thinking about not over anchoring in the academics, but also thinking about what other things, the sort of multi-pronged problems that are affecting our young people and impacting our young people. I just, even coming into today, I just couldn't stop thinking about how a few months ago, when we were planning for the fall, we really thought we would be in a different place by now. And so for me, what I've started thinking is like, we actually have to be prepared to be unprepared for the school year. And by being prepared to be unprepared means like all of the stuff that the other two panelists started off with in terms of the innovation, the opportunities for us to do things differently. We have to be prepared to pivot back to that kind of thinking and not just get stuck in sort of, okay, we've done the reimagining and this is how we're going to do it. But we have to be ready to still be flexible and to still be adaptable, because this school year hasn't even started yet. And even, we're hearing qualifiers like, God willing, if we go back to school, right, in this conversation. And we just don't know. The sort of unpredictable nature of where we are right now compounds all the loss and all of the grief and the anxiety that we're feeling as adults, but our young people are certainly feeling our secondhand anxiety and stress, but also their own, right, experiencing this pandemic in their own right, in their own way, and experiencing loss in many different ways. And so I think I'm going to end with this, which is I was on I was watching a webinar in which some young people were talking about their experience with school during a pandemic. And one of the questions posed to the panelists was, what can we do to help make school better for you? And his response was, school isn't the problem, my life is the problem. And as heartbreaking as that was to hear, it also really illuminates this fact that it's actually not the student's life that's the problem, it's the systems of oppression, the barriers that are presenting this young person with the types of choices they have to make to work, to support their family, to support people in their intergenerational household. Those are the things that he was talking about that were the problem. And so I think what we're doing and what I'm trying to do specifically with the mentoring work that we're doing at BPS is trying to help young people, one, get resources to the real life problems that they have and connect them to those resources, but also start to see, right, the systemic underlying root causes of these problems, so that it kind of lessens their viewing it as like, this is my life is what the problem is, because their lives are to be celebrated and we want them to thrive. So
thank you. No, thank you. And we have more to ask you. Thank you so much. Misha, I'm gonna ask you the same question.
So, yep, the problem.
What's the problem?
So the problem is we have all gone through a thing that no one in this world has gone through before. And our students have gone through it with us, a pandemic. None of us ever thought that the world would shut down on us the way it did, and that it was possible, like that was even possible. And so that's problem number one. And while we were locked up and locked in houses, our students were disconnected from school, from learning, from their friends, from their communities, from their families. I mean, when I got vaccinated, I was so happy to see my aunt and give her a hug, right? Little things. But while all of that disconnect was happening, our students also watched the world unfold. They watched racial unrest happen, and they were glued to their homes. And so they watched things that we knew happened, that we imagined happened, but they watched it happen. And so there was like a dual pandemic. It was the racial unrest, systemic racism, and it was the pandemic. It was COVID-19. I think the other, if that's not enough, I think another problem that we have to really think about is how we address this narrative that will potentially be created for communities of color and for traditionally disenfranchised communities around what they don't know and what they can't do. And, we have to really balance that with the fact that whether you are, I was on a call earlier where someone said we've all been in the same storm, but not in the same boat, right? Some of us were kayaking through the storm, and some of us were in, the yacht, right? And so for those of us that were kayaking through the storm, we had a very different experience. It was very rocky, it was very hard, it was unstable, it was unrelenting. And while it wasn't comfortable in the big boat, right? It was still, there were icebergs up ahead. It was still a very different experience. And the realities of those communities that none of us were surprised by, wherever we live, the communities that were hardest hit, the communities that didn't have access to Wi-Fi, the communities that had the most disconnect, the community that had low attendance, none of us were surprised by that. And so all of those problems position us to do the thing that we really need to do, and that is create the system, the school system that our students actually deserve.
Thank you so much for that, all four of you. And we could have that, we could just literally keep asking that question over and over again, and it would be an hour and a half of us starting to really unpack what has happened in what will now become the last 3 academic school years, right? We can't lose sight of that either, right? We're not talking about, we keep saying a year because it like makes us comfortable. It's 3 academic school years that will have been impacted by this pandemic. Before we talk about building the system we want, before we talk about even sort of anchoring in academics, which I want us to spend some time thinking about, I think it's important, to Emma's point, to talk about the mental health of our students, our families, our workforce. And to your point, it's reported that 35% of parents are extremely concerned, a third of parents are extremely concerned about their child's mental health. So while we're facing a crisis of unfinished learning, we're equally facing a crisis of unsupported mental health needs. I'm going to start with you, Bethany. How are you thinking about that, and what are you thinking are sort of strategies for us to be addressing those needs in real time? And then Suzanne, I'm going to also ask you the same question.
So there are a lot of initiatives that are going on at BPS around supporting students' mental health, and a lot of we have an influx of social workers coming into the schools next fall, or oh my gosh, next month. So we have a range of supports that have been developed and will be implemented specifically to address the mental health outcomes that we know young people are experiencing because of the pandemic. In my work, the work that I do, I am currently developing a number of mentoring pilots, so mentoring programs. And one of the key things that we do in the programs that I am leading is we start from a place of, we're trying to create schools and then beyond that, communities and worlds where young people can thrive. And so part of that work in creating those spaces is making sure that the adults that are supporting the young people have been really trained in terms of understanding the impact of a young person's identity on how they experience the world, in understanding cultural wealth. We have a framework at BPS for culturally responsive teaching that is called Culturally and Linguistically Sustaining Practices, with a set of competencies and skills that are associated with it. But really what it asks for adults to do is to reflect on their own biases, unpack some of their own biases, think about their own identity and how they navigate the world and how that impacts their relationships with young people. and then approach building relationships with students, with young people and their families and the communities that they belong to from a place of cultural humility, from a place of genuine and respectful and rigorous inquiry into the cultures of others, and then really building an authentic relationship. And then through that, really leading to developing practices and behaviors that support culturally and linguistically sustaining work. And so we're really focusing on working with our mentors to give them a lot of support, a lot of coaching around disrupting some of the narratives too that we hold around young people. Another one of the panelists mentioned some of the narratives that we have around our communities, and so part of our work really is thinking about what do we as adults within our school district already think, imagine, what do we think is possible for our young people, and have we unintentionally limited what we think is possible for them, and sent messages to young people that also were limiting in terms of what they could be and what they can do with their lives. So I think a lot of what that work really leads to is creating a genuine place of care. And I will say that we have phenomenal teachers within BPS and phenomenal school-based staff, and they by and large are incredible and care deeply for their students already. It's not something we necessarily have to coach or teach them to do, but it is something that we have to all unpack for ourselves. Like, what are the biases that we bring to our relationships? And so what we really are trying to do with the professional development that we have developed for the mentoring programs that we've piloted and that we're launching is really focus on that sort of critical consciousness piece, on understanding community and cultural wealth, and really just getting to know young people as young people for who they are, and really allowing young people the space to just be their authentic selves. That's like a key feature that you have to have in any space for a young person to really thrive. They have to be able to bring their full authentic selves. And that is often part of what disrupts a young person's mental health is not being able to bring their full authentic self, really feeling like they're alone and isolated. And so we're hoping to connect more young people to more adults within their community, also thinking about connecting them to peers, recent graduates, any number of different types of models that we're exploring to try to just make young people feel assured and affirm that there is someone in their school community that cares about them.
Thank you so much for that, Bethany. Yeah, thinking about that sort of relational piece with school and a young person feeling connected to someone in the organization as a way of helping to address some of these big mental health issues that we're seeing. Susanna, I'm going to ask you the same question, sort of as we're seeing these numbers and we know that they are growing, right? Like every day there's increased sort of acute need that we're watching students experience and families experience. What are you thinking, and what are some of the solutions that you think are on the table?
Yeah, so in many ways, I couldn't agree more with Bethany. The one thing that I'd want to highlight is the connection between the social emotional development and well-being and the academics. I think they're really linked, particularly for students who spend so much of their lives in schools. It's really important to think of those things together. And sometimes we think we're going to work on the social emotional so that we improve the academic, but sometimes it works the other way. Sometimes success academically can make students feel like they belong better and connect more. So I think we have to think of this as kind of a whole of well-being, addressing the whole child or the whole student in what we're doing. And I think there are lots of opportunities to do this by, in some of the same ways, by bringing in members of the community to support students, but having some focus. I think that's why I've been spending a lot of time on this idea of high impact tutoring, because what you're doing there is you're creating a strong relationship between an adult and a student. And that strong relationship can help build a lot of this social emotional well-being that we're talking about. But at the same time, the way that they're doing it is often through academic success, through seeing that you can do, as a student, you can see that you can be successful at what you're something in some class, and that's really a way of engaging in school and then feeling you can be successful in other things. And I think that's why we see that in these programs that do such a good job, they do a good job, not if they're focused on math, not only on math, but it spills over to reading. The students attend more, they're more enthusiastic about schools. So I think we have to really think about programs that pull all those things together. A tutoring program that was just academic would not give you these kinds of long-term outcomes that we care about. I just saw this really cool study where they looked at teachers who were effective at improving test scores, and then teachers who were effective at kind of making students feel more enthusiastic about the classes. And the one who was better at improving test scores did a better job at improving test scores. But a few years out, they didn't. It was really this engagement in school, but connected to what they were doing in the classroom that led to engagement and success. So I think we should really be thinking about these, how they interact and what kind of programs we can put in that combine the academic and the social emotional.
Thank you so much, Susanna. And yes, and it is so easy for us to, because we think in sort of these boxes, right, to not really highlight how the academic success that a student experiences can feel good and can improve their sort of social and emotional experience in school. And I think we could unpack for days why so often where we fall into these sort of traps where it's one or the other, or we're trying to navigate how to do both, and that they actually are working together in tandem.
And mentoring that doesn't connect to school may be good and we want it, but it may not be as good as it can be, because then the student goes back and struggles in the class and says, oh, well, I can only, this isn't for me. And so if we can connect those, I think we'll really be in better shape.
I love that. I'm going to shift gears, and I want to hear, and I'm going to start with you, Emma, but I'm curious from your end, how is this summer different than other summers in the past? Like, what are you seeing that you are finding interesting or promising that we should be keeping our eyes on?
Sure. So, I think this summer is different in a number of ways. I think it's been a uniquely difficult year for teachers and students and parents. And I think that folks came into the summer actually exhausted. Mm-hmm. And yet at the same time, what was really impressive is that districts also innovated in the midst of all of that and came up with new ways to engage students. I think one thing that's really different about this summer is that the job wasn't just to create great summer programs, it was also more than ever to get students actually to attend them. And so there are some students who have really totally disengaged from education altogether. Our research suggests that according to parents, chronic absenteeism nearly doubled over the past school year. And so those students have not been attending as much school as normal. And what was really worrying is that 40% of those newly chronically absent students had been attending no school at all, be that virtual or in person. And so I think the first role of the summer really was re-engaging students. And we saw districts across the country thinking about, how do we get students just comfortable with being in a learning environment again? And so summer programs have always had an element of enrichment, but I think there was more focus on that this year than ever before, is how do you bring those things together? And I love the way that Angelica from Rhode Island describes this. She describes this as broccoli and ice cream, where they bring the kids in with ice cream, which is maybe sailing or Olympic sports, but they don't forget the broccoli, which is the algebra as well. And, to Susanna's point, those things can really be self-reinforcing because you may be drawn in by the idea of some great enrichment program. But then if you feel like you've gotten academic success, that just gives you so much more confidence coming back into the school year. And some people love algebra. For me, algebra might be ice cream. Actually, not for me, but
for some
people, for someone, there must be someone out there.
It's so true. Thank you for that. I'm gonna ask you more about chronic absenteeism a little bit later, but I want to bring this over to Misha. New York City took on a really different summer. And so how were you guys thinking about the summer, and sort of what did you see, what were you finding that started happening in this new program? Tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So one of the first things that I had to think about when I got in this seat was summer. And the first thing I realized was it couldn't be the summer of summers past. You know, to Emma's point, it really had to be a bridge back to school. It had to be an opportunity. We had to create an opportunity to bring people back into buildings. And that wasn't about just closing the learning gap. It was about reconnecting to school. It was about rebuilding relationships. It was about, you know, making the social emotional connections. It was also about fun. Like that word that we don't really use in school as much as we should. And so we approached the summer from the space of how could we create an opportunity to accelerate learning while offering, you know, while partnering with our community-based organizations to build the bridge between school, camp, social emotional supports, and most importantly, fun for students. And it was probably, we had almost 200,000 students in our programs. We opened more buildings than we ever opened in the past. We opened over 700 buildings, and we offered free full day academic, you know, educational and enrichment programs to any family who wanted. So we shifted away from that deficit model of summer school, right? We shifted away from mandated children must report to buildings and shifted to, if you want to think about, you know, I don't know if I talk about my own 10th grader who is amazing, right? And didn't need academic support in the same way, but has absolutely benefited from the summer learning programs that she participated in. And so, you know, we created this program that was for the first time offered students K-12, any student who wanted to, in our K-5 schools. First of all, we'd never even offered summer learning to students in grades K-2, ever. It was not something we had done. And so we offered K-5 students 5 days a week, 8 to 6 p.m., a partnership between schools, community-based organizations, did the same thing for 6 to 8, but we did it 4 days a week from 8 to 4. We had more summer work opportunities for our high school students. And so it really needed to be about integrating enrichment, partnerships, academics, and fun, period. And there were so many students who came. The majority of the students who came hadn't been in a building since last March. And it was really, you know, and this is our last week, and as I visited sites across the city, you know, young people are excited about being back in school. I watched students who had never met their elbow partner in person meet their elbow partner for the first time, meet their teacher for the first time, sit in a classroom. I was with a group of second graders this morning who were just so excited about school and hadn't had a real school experience because we've been out of buildings for 18 months. And so I think the most important thing that we did was, one, we changed the paradigm of summer in New York City, but we changed it in a moment that we needed it most. And what I thought about was, so if I offer parents mandated kids a summer school program, will they come? Absolutely not. They don't want to come, because what we're telling them is there's something wrong with you that we need to fix this summer. And what we changed to was everybody, not all of us, would benefit from an opportunity to engage in academics, enrichment, somebody to get us grounded and engage in some cell activities to really build a bridge. And it was really exciting to see, and I really have to shout out all of the New York City public school principals who really partnered with CBOs to create the opportunities that our students deserve. And we poured tons of resources into this, because what we said to principals, and a principal said to me before I became chancellor, you know, just give us the money. We know what our kids need, and let us do what we need to do for them. And that's what they did.
I love that. I will say this really quick. One, there are kids who are always having summer experiences that are not mandated. Those are
Absolutely.
camps and all those things. Some of us get to send our own kids to them. Let's have just a very real moment. And so this idea that you are thinking about that same sort of enrichment approach, it goes back to like so many strategies that have existed that we've known were there, and the sort of political and financial will to realize them, and using, and to Susanna's point as well earlier, like using this moment to build the system we want. And these are those opportunities. I am curious, I will follow up with you, Misha, but to Emma's point earlier, I am curious to see if this was a strategy that brought in students who had experienced chronic absenteeism. Like, were you getting kids, so while you got kids who haven't been in school, were we also getting kids who were not engaging in learning? And it'll be interesting. I know how the data machine works in New York City. It will be interesting to find out, because we will all learn from it, if that is the case. I'm going to keep moving us along, though I could spend more time on thinking about that particular summer programming. Is there anything, and this is really, I'm opening this up to everyone, is there anything that we are seeing that's happening this summer, and we don't have to name names, but that we're also just thinking, this is not working. This is the wrong direction. Everyone's silent. All right, I'm not gonna stay on this point too long, but I will say, we are still watching other districts who engaged in more traditional summer school programming. And so it'll be interesting to also see, and I think to Emma's point earlier around chronic absenteeism, like what are probably some of our biggest work to do is bring kids back into learning who have literally stopped attending learning experiences. So it'll be really interesting to see how if any of these sort of summer programs are able to do that, including traditional sort of more punitive summer programming, summer mandates. We don't know, right? We'll find out. I want to move us along around sort of evidence-based reforms that you think people should be focused on. So we've talked about this summer being one of them, things that we know work, that we've been talking about working to address the opportunity gap, but now is sort of the time for us to see those in action. Emma, I'll start with you. In your research and the work that you've been doing pre-COVID to think about learning loss and education outcomes, were there things that you are just sort of hoping, like, we have evidence, we know this works, this is what I want people sort of thinking about and out there in the ethos?
Sure. So I think there's some just fundamental things from a system perspective that we know work. We know that having a high quality teacher in front of every single student, ensuring that we are attracting and retaining the best possible teachers and equipping them with the skills they need, with the high quality instructional materials, providing them with job embedded, on the job coaching that's curriculum aligned. There are some kind of basics there that not every district is doing, and we need to continually be pushing ourselves to get that in front of every student. I think then there's a series of other things that the pandemic has really highlighted that are very effective. And one is around this whole child student mindset. We've known for a long time that student mindsets are important actually in improving student outcomes. And we did some analysis back in 2017 on the PISA results, which is the Program for International Student Assessment that's done of about 78 countries. And the greatest predictor of student outcomes in PISA was student mindsets. Things like growth mindset, motivation calibration, understanding what it meant to succeed, senses of belonging. Now, it's hard to always know if correlation is causation, but I think coming out of the pandemic, really understanding how we can support the whole child can have some of that impact on the academics as well. And then there's things that I think have worked historically in quite a small scale to accelerate students' learning, which we really have the opportunity to scale up. One of them is high dosage tutoring. I'll let Susanna talk about that. She knows it much better than me, and she can go much deeper than I can on it, but I'm very excited about it. I'm concerned that there probably isn't as much take up as I'd love to see of that as we move forwards. I think the second is acceleration academies, where students get really focused support over vacations, where they're in smaller groups with significant amount of instruction on elements of especially early literacy or middle school math, where they really just need that acceleration. And then I think the third area, which is really important, is just exposure to grade level material. And so one of the things that has been shown several times is that students who are Black or from low income families are less likely to be exposed. Their teachers are more likely to kind of water down materials and not expose them to the high quality grade level materials that they deserve. And so being able to work out, how do we not remediate kids? How do we expose kids to grade level, but also scaffold them to be able to access that, whether that be through additional tutoring or personalized learning or other elements.
I like this, and I appreciate you sort of holding us into both spaces, right? That stuff we know works, that we're always talking about, and we are pushing districts to achieve high quality teachers in every classroom, you know, standards-based instruction, et cetera. And then, you know, these three sort of stuff and things, right? Real sort of programmatic things that districts and schools can be building. So Suzanne, I'm gonna bring it to you because it makes sense after Emma called on you. Talk to us about high impact tutoring as one of the solutions, but also, you know, your work and your research is so much bigger than that. So if there are other things that you think we should also be thinking about, please share. But I think it would be really helpful for us to learn from you, like, what is, but we all use the word tutoring in our everyday. So like, what is high impact tutoring? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What is it kind of, how does it happen on the ground?
No, that's great. And I loved, Emma, how you described that. I definitely couldn't have done it so well, but I think that it's just right. You need these really high quality classrooms doing with, you know, wonderful teachers, high quality materials and curriculum, and that's the basis. But even when you have that, you're going to have kids who either could accelerate and this isn't quite where they are, or they've missed something that lets them not be able to engage in this grade level material. And it's turned out this high impact tutoring really has been shown to be effective. I mean, research, I love research, I do research. Research is usually like, yeah, it's pretty good. This isn't like that. High impact tutoring is kind of consistent across grade level, across subject area. You see that intensive tutoring that has people who are good at creating strong personal relationships between the student and the tutor and have really strong materials, those things can make huge differences. So for example, instead of learning a year or less than a year of learning, you could learn 2 years in 1 year. There's a program that's shown that in math, in a really good study. In reading, you can do almost 2 years worth for younger kids. So it gets these really, really big effects. But sometimes we think about tutoring when we think of homework help. And this really isn't homework help. It's not a student having the opportunity to go to someone and say, this is my problem, can you help me solve it? Many students don't know why they're not understanding the material. In fact, they don't understand the material. The ones who really don't understand it really don't know why they're not understanding it. So what you need instead is some kind of program where it's small groups. So it could be these acceleration academies, or it could be the high impact tutoring, where you're working closely with someone who knows you and you can trust and who can assess what your difficulties are and knows what kind of material to give you so that you progress over time. And we've have 7 elements that we think go into this. And the first is the tutor. Many people can be good tutors, but they need to be able to connect to students. And to do that, they need some kinds of training and oversight. So you have the tutor, you've got the instruction, you need a lot of it. Generally, these programs tend to be 3 to 5 days a week for at least a semester that you're working, and it has to be supported by good materials. So, the fourth is data, and you need data to assess. And the data can come from anywhere. It doesn't have to be kind of formal data. It can be information from the teacher about what students know or what they don't know. Or in many cases, the program includes assessment as you move along. And so you can continuously know how a student is doing. So you need that kind of data. And the last is some integration with school. And there's certainly the benefit of integrating with school, being part of the school day, because the tutor and the teacher get to interact and the student sees this as part of the school day. But I think the primary reason there is that then the students who really need it show up. If you put it after school or before school or something like that, particularly in high school, you're going to lose many students who have lots of other responsibilities outside of school. So providing it in school is really, really important for the equity. So those are the 4 features. And then underlying it, these programs also are really based on safety, and they're cohesive programs, and there's a focus on equity. And I think you really want programs that are focused on equity too. So we've taken those 7 characteristics of high impact tutoring. Oh, I think you're muted.
I am muted and now I am unmuted. Thank you, I said. And so I think there's so much there and it's rich. I'm going to throw this same question to our other panelists too, if you want to answer it. You don't know pressure. But is there something else in the mix, evidence-based research, either that you're seeing happen in your districts or that you're about to launch that you want to talk about?
So I just add just a couple of things. One, I think is super important is that the reforms are implemented with fidelity. One, right? Like that they are truly implemented with fidelity and not surface experiences. We have an opportunity to really think differently. But I just also add 3 things besides the fidelity of implementation that, you know, we are leveraging and creating and engaging in culturally responsive curriculum so that our students see and experience themselves in their learning, that we are leveraging student voice in a moment when, you know, coming out of a pandemic, when students were able to mute the teacher, mute themselves and completely disconnect. We need to make sure that they know that their voices are heard and valued. And then the last thing, and I hope this is true for the country, definitely was true for New York City, really engaging with families. You know, the number of families who participated in town halls, parent association meetings, you know, community city, for us, this we call our CECs, but probably for you all, you know, board meetings increased widely because they had access virtually. And so parents could be on the bus or on the train or in their car and zoom into a meeting. And so like, it's really important, you know, the parent as a partner is critically important. And sometimes in high poverty, low income communities, we don't value that. And we need to value that because that's a student's biggest ally. And so I just think like really thinking about how we continue to leverage our parents as partners in student learning.
If there is, I'm going to build off of that. It's a question I had planned on asking later, but what should our families be thinking about right now, right? We have, and this audience tonight is pretty mixed, right? We have folks who are at Wheelock College as students. We have folks who are at Wheelock College as students who are parents. We have parents who are joining in. We have parents of students who are neurodivergent, who are students at the Ivy Street School watching tonight. You know, folks are coming in from everywhere. And they're asking the same question, like we're talking about what schools should be doing, but what should parents be thinking about and doing at home? And I'll start with Bethany if there's something that's on your mind, and then I'm gonna open it up to our other panelists as well.
So thank you so much for the question. And all of the responses to the previous question have been incredible and really, I've been thinking about the work that I've been doing and how some of that is happening. In particular, you know, the mentoring work that we do is really collaborative. So it's not just me, you know, designing these mentoring programs, but working with, you know, academics and working with accountability and working with community engagement and really using some of these mentoring initiatives as vehicles for whole child instruction, for making sure that there's access to arts and health education. Sometimes we are able to work into our curriculum elements of those subjects, which, you know, some schools have and some schools don't. I'm just thinking about all of those things. But in terms of families, I think, it's as you start to ask the question, Brandon, I feel personally a little bit disconnected from families, and I actually I wouldn't suppose to respond to the question, what should families be doing? Maybe have some of the other panelists, I'll defer to some of them, but I think what I'm really interested in, what I'm curious about is listening more to families and hearing more about what they need and just what they've been going through, and trying to figure out if our programs are the right programs for their young people. The thing about the work that I'm doing is that I'm not just someone who believes in mentoring as a practice that can be effective and can support social emotional learning, mental health, academics, all of those things. I think it's really rooted in relationship, right? And really rooted in trust, and really rooted in a meaningful, authentic relationship. And that includes, I think, to our families. And, I think there's a lot of work to be done there, at least in our school district, to really engage families in a meaningful and authentic way. So for me, my answer to that question is that I really would love to hear from families more in terms of what they need right now.
I hear that. I hear that. Other folks, what do you think our families should be thinking about right now? Is there anything that they should be doing at home to really address some of these bigger issues and challenges that we're seeing?
I see that I'm up here. So I think there are things that parents can do, but there are also things that the schools and teachers can do to connect to the home that I think can make the classrooms better as well. So we just did a study in about 6 districts in Texas where teachers went into the homes, or at least met and had visits with parents that were not academic, that were about the whole child and what the parents wanted for their child and saw for their child and thought about their child. And it turned out to really be impactful for the teachers and to affect how they taught and how their students thrived in the classroom. And I think that's because what they saw were all the assets in the home, all the things that the parents could do. Sometimes you send things home to parents, and I think that's why I worry about what should parents be doing. Sometimes that doesn't work with whatever they're doing. Nonetheless, they have these other ways that it could work. So I would really make sure to build that I think building that understanding is really important between the home and the school. And then in terms of what parents should do, I think in some ways it's always like that. You want to look out for the well-being of your child. But I really think there are lots that schools can do to kind of better utilize the home and not conflict with the home in the ways that sometimes interactions between schools and families do.
I appreciate that. I think it's a challenging one too, right? Because every family is in a different place right now, and trying to allow for that grace. And I hear you, Susanna, and same from you, Bethany, right? Thinking really about what our schools can be doing better to empower our families, to engage our families, to listen to our families. Emma, I want to ask you in that vein, are you seeing any sort of strategies in your research that have shown really strong ways that districts or schools have re-engaged the students who are chronically absent, or even families in their work?
Sure. So I think that we're seeing districts across the country re-engage families more and look at stakeholder engagement not as a one-way process where we work out the strategy and we communicate it to you, but in a process of we develop together what the aspirations are for our schools and our communities. And so I think that that's one big piece. I think that really tactically districts are doing some really interesting things to re-engage students and families. And so one that I'm really interested in, Chicago Public Schools created a student prioritization index, And so based upon a host of different factors, including attendance, performance in school, behavioral factors, community factors, they worked out which students were really at risk, kind of like an early warning system on steroids, to understand which students were at risk of not coming back the next school year, which students were at risk of dropping out. And we're really worried about student dropouts right now. Some of our research suggests that we could be looking at 600,000 to 1.2 million additional kids dropping out of school because of the pandemic if we can't reach these students. And so what Chicago Public Schools did is they then took that index that they looked at every single student, and then they created different strategies at each level, at each tier. So at kind of tier 1, they had kind of mass campaigns about back to school, the summer engagement, inviting people in. At tier 2, they actually went to communities, and in specific communities that they identified were more at risk, they did door knocking campaigns, specific language campaigns in people's home languages so that people would understand and hear what was happening. And then for tier 3, there was a much more one-on-one approach. So they would call the actual family, they would try and engage, they would go, if they couldn't get through on the phone, they would go and they would sit on the doorstep, they would have a conversation, they would understand what some of the barriers were for that family in re-engaging with education. You know, maybe some of the students had jobs. And so in recognition of that, they offered some of those students paid opportunities over the summer. And so really trying to understand some of the root causes of what's going on, not forcing kids back to school because you have to go back to school, but understanding where the families were coming from, what some of the barriers were, and then re-engaging those students and their whole families.
Thank you for that, Emma. Misha, are there ways that in New York City you guys are trying to either understand the student experience and also surveying families or trying to get some data from families on what's working and what's not working? And I think to Emma's point, you know, in service of building a much more collaborative process around the bigger strategy.
Yeah, so I would also just go back to the last question and say, Bethany was very kind and gracious and said, I'm not going to tell families what to do, or, you know, we really lean into what families need. But in that recommendation was a wonderful recommendation for families, which is talk to us. Tell us what you need us to do. Tell us what you need from us. We need to be listeners in a very real way. So we are going to be leveraging a social emotional screener, you know, for every student in New York City. And we did a lot of work, a lot of research on what was the right screener, and really wanted to lean into a screener. And we decided to use the DESA screener. And we decided on that one because it really takes an asset-based approach to where students are. And there are different kinds of screenings out there, and some of them really like focused on behavior and focused on negative behaviors. And we wanted to, you know, and you'll hear me over and over again, really speak from an asset-based space of what students have learned, what students have gained, what teachers have learned and gained, and how we build from that space. And also what families have learned and gained, and how we build from that space. And so we look forward to really using that screener in collaboration with families to think about how do we personalize learning more specifically to address, you know, that ugly word, learning loss and unfinished learning, to really address those things so that we can really develop a partnership with families around, you know, how do we really move our students to the next level?
Perfect. Thank you for that, Misha. I want to move us in. We have some videoed questions that we asked some of our friends to send us. So the first question is from Katie Lynch, and she's the executive director of the Lynch Foundation. And I'm going to let the video play.
So at the Lynch Foundation, I think our concern is around the health and well-being of our kids and our country, and taking thought around what and how best to use this really transformative experience that we've all been through together, and embrace the opportunity of this $200 billion investment in public education across our country to really think and empower parents and students and teachers to think differently about what education looks like for them individually. What would it look like if we actually empowered students and parents to make choice and decision around how they spent their quote unquote allocation, as Congress thought about this as per pupil? What if we could all imagine giving each child the opportunity to create his or her own portfolio around their individual needs?
So, this is a big question, and some of that money is being spent as we speak, or was spent before it arrived. But, I think what I'm hearing from Katie's question is, smart ways that districts are thinking about this sort of resource distribution, and ways, to our earlier conversation, that parents and students are being involved in that process. So I'm going to open this up to all of our panelists, but how are you guys? Are you seeing anything? Are you hearing anything? Are you leading anything that you think is of note we should discuss?
I can have a couple of examples that I think are really interesting, which kind of go along the sort of reimagining education ideas where parents and students have new choices. And so one is in Dallas, they worked with their school communities to work out, if we're going to provide you with more educational time, how do you want that to happen? And they provided a number of different options, and they ended up with some schools going for 5 additional intersession weeks and other schools adding 23 school days to the year. But it was a community-based process where schools opted in based upon a certain number of teachers and parents and students, and the principal all had to buy into this model in order to adopt it. And so there was a natural, I think I saw a question in the Q&A, how do you get teachers to buy in? And I think it's by having them as part of the process of the decision making really makes a difference. And so that was kind of one example I thought was really interesting, because obviously more time is one of the levers that you can use if you're trying to catch up time that's been potentially lost, right? Then the second one I thought was kind of interesting, the state of Tennessee. And this is an example of really thinking about, well, are there, to Misha's point, things that we've learned in the pandemic, new ideas, so they're assets, things that we can build upon. And they're actually now offering a full range of AP classes virtually. So we know that many, many high schools aren't able to offer every AP class. Some high schools don't offer any AP classes. And so having students who are maybe at a small rural high school, being able to opt into a virtual AP class on top of their in-person education really offers new opportunities to students and new choices.
Thank you for that.
Can I try one thing on this? So I think thinking about the individual student and their needs and choices is just where we need to go, that we have to kind of think about individualized education for each student. And before that kind of seemed unimaginable, but we really have, we think of technology as online courses, but technology can really help us to organize ourselves so that we can follow a student and really know each student well. And so I like this idea of kind of the student being at the center. I think the idea of taking all the money that's been out there, the 20 or even more billions of dollars going in to address learning loss, and thinking of splitting it and having parents choose, I don't think that's at all the right way. I think we have students with very different needs, and that we as a country should be investing so that all students have equal opportunity, and that means really spending different amounts on different kids. And so I love that individual thing, and I actually think that's where we're going, and that's where we should be going.
Thank you so much. I want to move us into another question. We have video tonight from Jody Asabel Clark from turk.edu.
Hello, my name is Jody Asbel Clark. Educational researchers found that during COVID, students had vastly different experiences, particularly neurodiverse students, with some falling way off the radar without their typical supports, while others thrived under the new setting. And so I'm wondering how we can use the research on executive function and social emotional learning, along with some of the innovations that people found during COVID, to provide strategies and educational experiences that might be more accessible to neurodiverse learners and might leverage some of their assets, their cognitive strengths, such as computational thinking and project-based learning.
Thank you, Jody. Misha, I want to hear from you. How are you? I'm thinking about students, neurodivergent students, but also special education students and the services that they receive. Have you seen any innovations through this time, and anything that you as a district and as the district leader are hoping to hold on to?
So I think that, we were able to personalize learning for students in very different ways. I think that's what the technology offered us the opportunity to do. And students also became owners of their learning in different ways. And so I think we want to leverage that. I would also say, I want to move completely away from remote learning because remote learning is a solution to a pandemic, and move into how do we leverage online learning platforms to innovate our systems forward. And I think that is the moment that we really have to shift to. How do we use it to personalize learning, to create access to high-level courses across districts and boroughs? Like, we no longer have to be, if Boston Public Schools is offering a Mandarin class and I have a student in New York City who's interested, we can cross all kinds of bridges and roads. And so how do we break down district borders, state borders, develop deeper partnerships to create access and opportunities for students across the country, but students who traditionally are left out of these opportunities? And so I really see it as a moment to really innovate forward and to really, deepen our partnerships in education.
Yeah, I want to open this. Thank you for that, Misha. I want to open this up for other folks because, there's so many ways we can be thinking about this moment, and there are obvious successes that we've seen, to Emma and Misha's point tonight. Anything else that folks are seeing, particularly for students with special needs, that you are hoping we hold on to?
I think one opportunity that I see, and this isn't, I just came out of the ASU-GSV conference, so this isn't from our own research, and this is just having talked to a bunch of folks, but within special education, especially in smaller districts, there's a real challenge that a child with a specific special need may have been only seen by that district once, or once every 10 years. And so in some of the larger districts, there's enough repeatability that you can get a good sense of what are the right interventions, what are the ways to help that student. In a lot of smaller districts, it's kind of trial and error, and it's really hard to be an expert in everything. And I would love to be able to work out, and there's obviously a real question around student privacy that we have to be extremely careful of in sharing any data, especially really sensitive health data. But are there ways that we can use some of the data that's collected through IEPs to identify what are the interventions that are helping students and create a better playbook? And this is, again, to Susanna's point, sometimes the technology is not the up and front and center. It's not the kid on the iPad. It's what's happening behind the scenes to support the kid to get the interventions they need, to understand what it is they know and don't know, what they need to take the next step. And I'm thinking that's true in spades in special education, especially in smaller districts where, with the best will in the world, you just can't be an expert in everything. But if you could have a better playbook of these are the interventions that have worked with students who've shown these kinds of markers historically, it would enable you to provide much better services to those kids.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Emma. I'm going to bring us into this third video. It's from our friend Stephen Sawchuk at Education Week.
Thank you, Brandon. My question is not about what we can do, but about what we can let go of. We know that as we try to accelerate learning, tutors will have to interleave some foundational skills with grade level content. We also know that our curriculums are stuffed already, and that students' mental health needs are a priority. What, in your estimation, can we ask teachers to stop doing, and how can we communicate that to them?
I love this question. What can we stop doing? What I have now watched many of panels, read many of things. No one is telling us what to stop doing. Bethany, I'm going to start with you. I'm curious your idea, like, what can educators stop doing right now that's not serving us?
This is such a delicate question. I think, I do want to reiterate what I said earlier, which is that, there's so many incredible educators in our district and across the state and across the country that, I have seen firsthand go above and beyond during the pandemic. One of the things that I'm actually, proud of with the mentoring work that we did is that we recognized that a lot of these teachers and not just teachers, but other school-based staff were already serving as mentors to young people, were already taking time out of their day before school, after school, during the one, period where they had a break to meet with young people one-on-one, to help support them and to help support their sort of personalized learning and their individualized learning. And we sort of formalized it, and we started paying teachers for the hours they spent mentoring. We started developing, the standards and professional development so that we could have a mentoring program implemented with fidelity. So I think, there's a lot of good things that our teachers are doing. So I just want to start with that. But I think there are, and going back to what I opened with, there are a lot of narratives that teachers and other school-based staff, other folks within our district hold about young people that aren't necessarily rooted in who our young people really are. There are a lot of adults in our community who don't necessarily see young people the way they see themselves. There's a lot of implicit bias. There's outright racism that happens. There's homophobia, transphobia. There's a lot of different ways that even adults who are well-intentioned might be harming our students. And so I think, and one of the questions in the Q&A around teacher buy-in, said that there's some teachers that are resistant to change or resistant to certain trainings. And I think, those are the teachers that need it the most. And so we have to keep offering opportunities for our educators to receive this training around equity, around racial equity, around gender and sexuality equity, around adultism. I think one of the main things that I have seen adults really struggle with within the district is really undoing and unpacking some of the beliefs that they have about like what is possible for young people, like what are young people capable of, and really just expanding that sense of possibility is, I think, so important. Yeah. And just also seeing young people as humans, right? Like seeing young people for their humanity, seeing young people as complex beings who are the experts of who they are. So I think, a lot of adults have some letting go of to do when it comes to just what we think is possible for our young people.
Yeah, thank you for that. Anyone else, things that you would like to see that you think it's the right time for educators to stop doing?
I'll say two things. Stop being afraid of devices. It's how young people got through 18 months of remote learning. They know how to use them to find information. So let's really get creative about how we bring them into learning, and stop holding on so tight. Teachers had to release the reins and had to trust students to take risks and try things on their own. And our greatest classrooms are places where learning is facilitated, right? And not directed. And so I would just say, though, don't be afraid. Let's welcome the devices in and figure out how to make them a part of our classroom and let go of the ways we've held on so tight.
I love that, Misha. Thank you. Susanna.
Okay, I'll try one. So I actually think it's time to kind of, well, hopefully diversify the educator workforce so that different people have different roles in it. And that, I think, could really help reduce the reduce some of the burden of all these added on things. So you can imagine bringing other people in as really important educators in the school. We've seen a big increase in paraprofessionals, much bigger than we have in teachers over the last 30 years. We can have many people in the school who probably can represent the community better and will know the community better than many of the folks in the teacher workforce. It gets more adults in the school, which can lighten the load. I do think too, we expect the teachers to come in and on their first day teaching, have all the exact same responsibilities as teachers who have 20 years of teaching. And I think there are lots of things we can pull back on with first year teachers in terms of having to do certain kinds of lesson plans and all these other kinds of things that they can really be given at least as a start. And then as you go get more experience, then you have more time because some of the other things aren't taking so much time. So I think it is time to rethink the educator workforce in schools, expand it and differentiate it. And that's where we'll get some of this ability to do all these things that the students really need. I think we understand that they need this and that this seems like the only way we're going to make it happen.
And the career ladders that our communities deserve too, at the same time. Yeah. Emma, it's on you. What are we letting go of?
I am piling on to Susanna just because as I think of all of the things that are on teachers' plates, I think the answer has to be to have a multi-classroom leadership model and unbundle the role of the teacher so that the teacher is part of a broader community that's supporting students. And so there are just a couple of examples where I think this is being done really well. Opportunity Culture is in a bunch of school districts across the US and has a model of master teachers, which really creates that career ladder, but it also gets the master teachers, the excellent teachers in front of more kids. So more kids get exposure to a great teacher and creates a training on-ramp for associate teachers through some paid residencies. So that's kind of one example of that. Another example of that is I see a lot of districts, Bethany, you mentioned Boston. I know also San Antonio Independent School District is also ramping up social workers. So a social worker in every school so that teachers have someone to go to when a student approaches them with a problem that suddenly they're going to lose their home, or they don't have food that evening, or they've experienced a loss, that there's someone that the teacher can go to and that can share that burden and can both coach the teacher, but also then take the opportunity to link that student through into some of the community-based organizations. The last example I'd love to give is one where it's a little more radical and it's really partnering with community-based organizations in different ways. And this is a school district called Edgecombe School District. They, after they did learning pods over the pandemic, really loved elements of them, that there were smaller groups, that they tended to be working with folks that looked like them, that students could identify with. And so moving into the next school year, they're still doing more traditional education in the morning. They're doing math and phonics in more traditional classrooms, but in the afternoon, they're actually leveraging partnerships with community-based organizations to do some really interesting project-based learning around social science and science in smaller groups. So again, thinking out of the box to how can you bring in new resources into your school to achieve some of these things without burning out.
I appreciate that. We have just a few minutes left. And so I want to say this before we wrap up. One, I am fully aware, as David and I got the opportunity to open this thing, that he and I were both in many ways brought into an industry that has always been centered on the incredible work of women, from the earliest schoolhouses to today. And so I feel just deeply honored, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this, to get to share this space with 4 powerhouse educators who are driving, I got goosebumps when I said it, powerhouse educators who are driving our systems and our thinking and the lives of young people and educators from such different pockets of the industry. I feel very lucky that I got to share tonight with you. I feel very lucky that everyone who joined this panel got to hear from you. And I also am deeply, deeply thankful for the work that you each individually do. You are leaders in education. This is one of the most complex moments in our history in the world of education. And as I sit here tonight and I'm sort of in awe of each of you, I am just really thankful that you are at the helm helping us figure out what we're going to do next. So on that note, I want to say thank you. I had a wonderful time. And I want to thank David and the entire BU team for helping bring this together. I want to thank everyone who attended this evening. Thank you all so much for being part of this conversation.